Okay, so this is the spring 2020 evolution unit, okay? And unfortunately for us, as of now, we still have an exam, a state of end of course exam to prepare for. And our end of course exam is going to cover everything in the year, including evolution. So we need to try to get as much of this done during this break as we can. And I say that because a lot of you might be going through some stuff. You might have to take care of some people at home, or there might be all kinds of things you have to do that I'm not aware of. So we're going to do our best to cover as much as we can, and I'm going to go over the material about 10 pages at a time and make sure that you understand the concepts, or at least try to explain the concepts. You have some things on the web page, including some interactive activities about evolution, and you also have a textbook chapter. They go over the concepts as well. So hopefully with these resources, we'll be well on our way to be prepared for this exam. The first page you see here is just a checklist of all the different topics that we're going to cover. As you cover the topic, as we discuss it, as you read about it, as you answer questions on it, you should go ahead and check off your list. Yeah, I get it. I've done the work. I'm ready. 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 However, as you're doing this, you're taking notes, you're answering the questions, and you think you have them right, and you think everything's going well, please remember you have to check your work. You have to check your understanding. If you're not checking your understanding, you can always end up thinking you understand something when really you got the wrong answer. So that's easy to do. It's always easy to do no matter what the topic is. So the best thing you can do for yourself is every time you go through a topic and a series or bits of information, you go ahead and do some questions. Try to find a practice quiz online. When we get back to school, of course, I will quiz you, and we will ask each other questions, and we'll do activities to make sure that all the topics are well understood the way that they should be. But the more you practice yourself, or test yourself, the more you quiz each other through social media. You don't have to actually meet in person. You can go through and check your understanding. Make sure you understand the words and the topics and the concepts the way they're meant to be understood. Then they show you here how the workbook works. So they show you all the different components of it, and how you should use the activities. Again, the activities are meant to see if you understand the ideas, understand the topics. I've seen a number of you go right to the activities to try to fill in the answer without reading. How many times have students come to me with questions where all I've done is pointed to the answer that's in the text. The answers to these questions are right here in the text. Don't do the word search strategy mistake, where so many of you start off with the question and then go try to find the answer in the paragraph. Don't do that. Read it. Process the information. Think about it. If the reading is not enough, you have your chapter reading. You have what this video is discussing. So there's absolutely no reason why you should be going right to the question and then going back and reading and trying to find the answer in a word search solution strategy. That works for an exam, when you're taking a standardized exam, SAT, ACT, AP exam, if you want to look at the question just so that you can read with meaning, that's fine. But now that you're doing initial learning and working out problems, you should start with reading, look at the diagrams, try to figure out what the diagrams is showing you, and then go back to the question and then go back to the reading if you have to. All right. So again, when you're looking at the activity page, they tell you there's some related articles. You can look up the word macroevolution in this case. The evolution 5 big questions you can look up, right? You can you can look these things up. You don't have to go to any specific web page. You can just go ahead and do a Google search on it. My bet is there's a Khan Academy on the 5 big questions of evolution. Interpreting activity coding system, right? So A induces application knowledge to solve a problem, right? So here's where includes the application of knowledge to solve a problem. So when you are looking at a problem like this, an A level activity, what you're doing is you're looking at an application of what you should have learned from the video, from the chapter, from this reading. And if you're able to answer these questions, then that's part of the way that you check your answer. Now here are some command words. These are words that you should be able to look at and know what they mean when you see analyze, annotate, apply, appreciate, calculate, compare. You should be able to understand what they mean by words like this. All right? So in this concept map for evolution, it helps you understand how the different components that we're going to be discussing are linked together. And obviously it's going to be important for you to understand the origins of life, the evidence that supports evolution, the human interventions in evolution, the mechanisms by which evolution occurs, and the patterns that evolution creates that allow us to predict future events or to predict where one species, how one species is related to another. So you don't have to memorize these orders, but you can see this is foreshadowing what we're going to be covering through the whole unit. It's also, as you go through the work, come back and look at the concept map. As you learn about artificial selection, come back and think and look at this map and see how is artificial selection connected to other things. And it's these connections and understanding these connections as we move through this unit that's going to help you answer questions and that are more complicated, that are asking you to apply. In application questions, it's incredibly important to understand the relationship between the ideas rather than just memorizing the definition of one concept. So as we go through this first unit, you have to think about these key terms, and we'll discuss each of those. Some of them you've already heard of, eukarya and archaea. Here's another checkbox. It's looking at objectives. And you have to ask yourself, can you discuss the possible origin of membranes in the first prokaryotic cells? Can you describe the primordial environment that's likely led to led to the formation of life on Earth? If you can discuss these things and look at those command words, what does describe mean? What does outline mean? What does describe? What is discuss? What is explain? What's the difference between the two? And so think about these command words when you see these, and can you do this? If you can't do this, then you have to work at developing your ability to do this. And don't forget your key concepts. These are key concepts. So if you're looking at this and you're like, well, what does this mean? Then you just don't know. then you have to go back and look it up and make sure you're ready for the exam. All right, so when we're looking at the formation of life, we have to ask ourselves, what is life made of? And everyone in the class should be able to say that the building block of life is a cell. And if the cell is the building block of life, then you have to ask yourself, well, what is a cell made of? How do you make life if there's nothing there, if there's just a big rock? How do you make life? Well, life has to be made, the cell has to be made from, I'm going to assume that everybody's able to do this because we've worked on it for so long and you've taken so many tests and quizzes that at this point I would expect that everyone would be able to answer that a cell is made from biomolecules. And if someone said that cells are made from biomolecules, then I would expect that someone else would be able to say that the biomolecules that they're made of would be lipids and amino acids or proteins, right? Well, let's just start with the grander things. Let's move to smaller, right? The proteins and carbohydrates. And nucleic acids. And I would hope that they would understand that this is going to be some kind of carbon chain. And that somebody else would say, well, that you need amino acids to make proteins. And somebody else would say, well, these are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, right? You know, that's kind of the hope. And then nucleic acids, one would hope they say some kind of nitrogen based base, some kind of nitrogen base is involved there. So there'd be nitrogen, and there'd probably, and hopefully somebody else would say, well, there's probably phosphorus. There's probably no sulfur, but there's certainly carbon, and there's hydrogen, and there's oxygen, and probably some nitrogenous base, you know, some kind of base, including a ribose sugar or deoxy. So hopefully you're able to answer these questions, this kind of question. When you see the origins of life, you're asking, well, how did these molecules come to be? Like, how did they just form? Is it some kind of magic? What conditions would allow for these biomolecules to form so that the first cell could form? So people have asked this question, and really, I mean, can anyone ever really know? The probable answer is no. But we can make some guesses, and we can test some ideas. We can say, well, life is made of this. So, is this stuff? Are these elements out there? How would we know? Well, we can take a look through telescopes, and because of something called red shift, well, we don't have to get into, and something called a spectroscope, we can look at the light coming from other planets, and we can tell how much of certain molecules and atoms and elements there are in any particular region of space. And how do we do that? Well, as light travels through different molecules, let's say water, H2O, As light hits it, it absorbs it, and water absorbs light, and it re-emits light. So when the molecule absorbs this light and re-emits light, the light frequency is changed. So it might have gone in one color and come out another color, and the color difference can be very small. But that machine that I mentioned earlier, it's called the spectrophotometer. We have big ones, we have small ones. We can actually tell the difference as we look through the spectrophotometer and look at the light coming in. What we see is a pattern of bands, different color bands. And each molecule, each element has its own pattern. And we can test that because we can look at those patterns here on Earth. We can look at these molecules by shining a specific frequency of light into sample that molecule and look at the pattern that we see and identify it. And then we can look at space. We can take our telescopes and point them to space, and we can look and we see what molecules are out there because we see those same patterns in space that we see here on Earth. So when we look at space and we see these clouds of gases, or we look at a specific star, or we look at a specific planet, we can tell if there's water there. We can tell if there's hydrocarbons, if there's methanol, if there's carbon dioxide, there's carbon monoxide. We can tell these things because we can look at those spectral patterns that we can see through a spectrophotometer, or a spectroscope, excuse me. Now, the idea that this interstellar gas, and it's dust and gas, when we look at these giant galaxies, there's obviously a lot of space in space, and as we have all this gas, there's this thing called gravity. It starts pulling everything around, and as it comes around, as this dust, this diffuse dust, interstellar dust, gets caught up in gravity, it gets pulled closer and closer to a center, like water going down a drain, and that those molecules, those atoms, they start to fuse in a process called fusion, and the sun is born. A sun is born. The sun is this really, really super gravity, really highly dense, massive object. It's incredibly big. If you can imagine that something like 1.3 million Earths, if this were the sun, it would take something like 1.3 million Earths to fill up the sun. You can take 1.3 million Earths and put in everything that you know of, and then everything underneath our feet. You can put 1.3 million Earths into this ball of fused elements and molecules. Again, it's mostly hydrogen and helium, just getting fused together, and that fusion releases a lot of heat and cosmic rays and different types of radiation, and that energy goes flying out into space, and we are sitting here, the third rock from the sun in the third orbit away from the sun, the first being Mercury, the second being Venus, and then Earth. You have this power, this energy comes and warms our green planet, our blue-green planet. And so when we look at the solar system, the sun looks big, but it's actually really massive. And there are some suns that are even bigger than that. So it's a lot of mass that it goes into it. And that makes sense if you think about it. If the sun's been burning if something's burning, eventually, this is just our common sense, right? What we experience every day. If the sun is burning and it's burning fuel, then eventually the sun is going to run out of fuel, right? So, and it's been around for billions of years. So how can something burn for billions of years? Well, it has to be really, really big. It has to have a lot of stuff. And so when we look at the sun, we really think about it. It makes sense that the sun is that giant, but it's still kind of scary. Or at least it is to me. It's just massive ideas. Anyways, the sun kept swirling. As things kept swirling, there were other gravitational pulls, other smaller celestial objects that formed, and we called those planets, and they continue to revolve around the sun to this day in a circle because of gravity. It's actually an ellipse. It's not a circle, but not a perfect circle anyways. Different distances from the sun, all the way from the planets to the planetoids to the asteroids. All these things are circle around the sun. Well, these other things that we call comets, and they're in bigger orbits around the sun. Now, these are orbits around the sun. The sun is these orbits we call our solar system. So the system is the stuff that's going around the planets, around the sun, and they're the solar system continues to go, way out here. We have an asteroid belt, and then we have Mars, and we have all different kinds of gas giants. Then we have the Kuiper belt. But in any case, you have all these planets out there. Well, they got these objects that come around every once in a while, and depending how often they come around depends on how far away they are. But these things called comets, and when we look at the sky, we see them. A lot of people have always thought of them as being on fire, right? That, great balls of fire from an old song. Because we see that they have these long tails. Well, what it turns out is these tails are not fire. These long white tails that we see in the sky. If you ever see a comet, they're kind of cute. They're kind of beautiful and very interesting to watch. These comets come flying around. The thing is that they're going around the sun. They're going around the sun in a very odd orbit. They go around in an elliptical orbit. So they actually leave our solar system and come back. So they're going around the sun, but they might come every 100 years. They might come around every, 20 years or whatever it is. Whatever the period is depends on how far out it goes. And so they're really going very fast, and they're just circling in a really weird elliptical orbit. The details are not really important for our discussions today, but these are made of ice. These are giant balls of ice, interstellar ice. It could be made, I say ice, obviously mostly water, but there's going to be other stuff in there. And these comets were here from the very beginning of our solar system. So were these asteroids from the very beginning of the solar system. They have been around. So these comets, the reason they have a tail is as this ball of ice gets near the sun, the water starts to melt, and then it starts to turn to gas, and since it's moving, the gas goes off into space, and the ball keeps going round and round. And eventually, obviously, this ball of ice will melt away, but these things are very large, obviously, because they've been around for a long time. So that comet eventually will disappear, will melt or evaporate away, and there are several comets, and I'm not sure exactly how many, but there are numerous comets that go around in different orbits. They come around at different times around our solar system in different directions. So And of course, our solar system is just one of many solar systems in our galaxy, in the Milky Way. And our galaxy is only one of many galaxies. So when we start to think about how, what space is, there's a lot of stuff out there, is the point. And when we're talking about how molecules first form, we have to ask ourselves, well, how is it that, you can get something as complicated as an amino acid or a quinone? Quinones are used in photosynthesis and in the electron transport chain in photosynthesis to transfer electrons. How is it that quinones can form? Well, it turns out that these, and we've done these experiments in cloud chambers, and those cloud chambers are basically just these isolated little balls of gas, and we control what gas goes in them, right? It doesn't have to be a ball, it can be a cube or whatever it is. And we can run electricity through it. We can run a wire, a positive and a negative, and connect it to a battery, some kind of power source, and we put whatever gases we want. We control the gas that's in here, the cloud, right? And as we run electricity through it, we see what kind of gases can form or what kinds of molecules can form. So we've done that, and we've noticed that in doing that in experiments, in labs, we've noticed that we can form all kinds of compounds like ketones, nitriles, ethers, alcohols, quinones. These are these organic molecules, these biomolecules that we see in life. We can make some of these rudimentary molecules in these chambers. These are the things, the building blocks of cells. We can make them in chambers. And what we've noticed is that we can even get amino acids to form. That's that Urey experiment we'll be talking about. And so these molecules can form simply by adding a lot of energy, a lot of heat, under the right conditions. And what we find when we look at if we add ultraviolet radiation, which comes from the sun, and we to these little balls of these little capsules of ice that are formed in space, right? That they make these biomolecules. That these little capsules of water and carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, methanol, they come together and freeze in this interstellar ice, and because of ultraviolet radiation, all these different components of these biomolecules can come together, and they can form the molecules that are necessary for life. So now at this point, you should be able to answer all three of these questions, right? Now, is it going to be easy? Can you do a word search and find those answers to these questions? No, but if you think about what I've said, and you think about what you've read here, you should be able to answer these questions, or at least come up with an answer. So let me just go ahead and read this with you. Suggests how sampling and chemical makeup of a comet. Remember, what is a comet? A comet is a ball of ice circling around the sun in a very large orbit, been here since the beginning of the solar system. How might that help us understand life's origins when you think about life as a cell that's composed of biomolecules? Then explain the significance of space, significance of molecules from space that naturally form capsule-like droplets when added to water. Capsule-like droplets, right? So molecules that come together and form capsules in water. How might that be significant? And you might want to read something like this, right? Right here, and think about it, right? Then explain how scientists were able to know about the existence of the complex organic molecules in space. There again, you can we can take a look at something like what we've discussed. Also, you might want to take a look at something like this. All right. That's all I can do for you on this page. In the previous video, we looked at the origin of basic precursor molecules, those organic molecules. How could they be made without life? And so we saw that under the right conditions in space, you could get those molecules forming. The next question is, how did life get set up on Earth? And there were, we should start with the idea that, first of all, the Earth, as far as we know, is about 4.6 billion years old. That's a big number, and it fits into the idea that life changed, that the world as we know it is not the world that was a long time ago. And we know how long it takes mountains to grow and how long it takes tectonic plates to move. We can measure, for instance, the San Andreas Fault, the movement, the side-to-side movement of the San Andreas Fault over time. So we have some idea of, even without some carbon dating and radioactive dating, other radioactive dating, we have some idea of how long it would take for the Earth to be to make the formations that we see today. But with accurate carbon dating and radioactive dating, we're pretty sure it's close to 4.6 billion years old. And of course, these are all very good guesses. They're probably fairly accurate within a certain percent error. Now, the formation of the Earth at 4.6 billion years, we know that because of those comets and meteorites hitting the Earth, that brought those precursor molecules. That was the first step, and I'm just going down the list of steps here. Okay, so there's steps here that tell you what the steps were for the beginning, right? The setup for the initiation of life. So first is the precursor molecule. All right. So where do we get the prebiotic molecules? Well, they came from space, right? From comets and meteorites. Let me make that a little neater. Hitting the Earth and seeding, if you will, the Earth with these precursor molecules. The next is that through some changes, through some high energy exchanges and under the right conditions, we saw that you could accumulate things like amino acids, purines. Remember, purines and pyrimidines were the nucleic acid nucleotides, right? Purines and pyrimidines. Those single ring and double ring structures. Sugars, lipids. These are all the things that you would need to make, the basic biomolecules that we've studied so hard over the last few months. So 3, the prebiotic condensation reactions. Remember, condensation reactions is when water is formed as you link these monomers. These are, remember, what we call the monomers, right? And these are the polymers. And you use condensation reactions to make them. And the key is that we start to, in step 3, you start to make some of these polymers. So things like peptides, these peptides and basic nucleic acids, probably RNA, probably. They were the beginning small polymers that would be necessary in order to get life jump-started. And the reason that they think, the scientists think that RNA was the molecule that was around, that was first made, was because RNA has self-catalyzing ability. In other words, it can make itself. So we can take a look here at this RNA. You see RNA forming, and it could start to make itself. And then, as you know, because you've studied transcription, RNA could then change over time, theoretically, to be able to make proteins as well. We know today RNA makes proteins, right? We know that ribosomes are made of RNA and proteins. And you know ribosomes make proteins. From mRNA in a process called translation. You know this at this point. You should know it. So when you see this, it shouldn't surprise you that scientists would think that RNA was the initial molecule, and then soon after, DNA became the long-term storage of genetic information, because RNA could make DNA as well, since RNA acts as a catalyst or an enzyme as much as a product of that enzyme, right? So you know RNA polymerase makes RNA, but ribosomes make proteins, and they're made of RNA, and RNA can read DNA and make mRNA. So you have that diversity of function that would be necessary for the first nucleic polymer to start life up. And then the fourth step would be lipids forming the bilayers that we've talked about, right? So they may not have looked exactly like the membranes that we've studied in class, but there were some kind of primordial bilayer of lipids that allowed an inside and an outside, right? And maybe it wasn't, and it certainly probably wasn't a membrane as we studied, but more likely it was a micelle or something like that allowed for inside function to be different from outside function. So the environment inside could be different from the environment outside, which allowed life to really get a good jump start when it was ready to start. And then the fifth step, just before life started, was you started to get a lot of the rudimentary processes going. And so if you look here, the fifth, there's a probiont, where you have an immediate precursor to the first living systems. Such probionts would exhibit cooperative interactions between catalytic peptides. So then now you have this, what they mean is that you have this inside and outside. Now inside you have some kind of, and you know, the specifics, I'm sure somebody knows, I haven't given it much thought, but the specifics, what might be something like you start to see enzyme 1, which the enzyme could be RNA, it could be a protein, start to work with enzyme 2. And then you start to add complexity from there until the point where you start to get life that has something that has the qualities of life, right? So they're able to replicate itself, it's able to process energy, it's able to react to the environment. All the qualities of life start to show up after step 5. But all these steps really are necessary, probably in some kind of order like this, in order to get that first cell. Even if you want to argue that the amount of time is different or whatever, the bottom line is that logically these are the steps that one would have to take in order to get things to work. You need the gears to make the machine work. You need gasoline to make the engine go. So logically, it seems that this makes the most sense as far as going from pre-life, before life, to life. Right, so the last step, then step 6 would be life. And there might be other steps in between that we haven't thought of, or I haven't thought of, but life then comes at least after step 5. After you have some rudimentary beginnings, then you have all the qualities of life, a double, membrane. You have probably some kind of prokaryote, some kind of non-nucleated, non-internal membrane creature that's able to replicate itself, to do some kind of binary fission, et cetera, et cetera. So some of the evidence for this is these stromatolites that we find in Western Australia, and you could take a look microscopically at them, and I've looked at them in detail, and I can tell you they're fascinating. It's hard to tell when you look at the details of stromatolites what exactly is what is. I'm not an expert at it, but they are fascinating to look at under a microscope. And what they are, they were mats of cyanobacteria, probably the first living organism, right? So at step 6, what probably came to be is something like cyanobacteria. So it might have been another type of bacteria, maybe before cyanobacteria. Well, it certainly there was something before cyanobacteria, but there's some kind of bacteria that could take life or light, energy, and depending on what that source of that energy was, and be able to replicate itself, be able to make more of itself, probably through something like binary fission, where they just split and split and split. Well, cyanobacteria were one of the first forms of life as we know it. Probably not the very first cell, but certainly the first one that I know of having evidence of it. And they formed these giant mats of life as they grew. Cyanobacteria are bacteria that can do photosynthesis. So let's be clear. They are probiotic cells, bacteria that can do photosynthesis. They can take light energy and make sugar. And that gives them the energy, the chemical energy they need to do binary fission. As you know, we're all at home. I'm at home here with everyone else locked up because of this COVID-19. So if you hear the blender going, the dogs barking, that's life. So anyways, the light comes in, hits the cyanobacteria, they grow, they live, they produce sugars, they do the things of life that we've studied over time over this last year. So they were one of the first forms of evidence of life, the oldest life forms that we've seen, been able to find recorded evidence of here in these stromatolites in Western Australia. We see the evidence of left over from their piled up existence. So you have So you have those 5 steps, and you have the last step, the example, right? This cyanobacteria, the example of life, early form of life. Now, it must be said, one of the ways we can test this concept is if we can find space out somewhere in space, a planet or a moon that has conditions like that of the pre-Earth. If we can find these complex molecules, if we can find somewhere along these steps of life formation, if we can find a moon that might have polymers, let's say, or a moon that might have the molecules, or a moon that might have, early ribosomes but no life, just catalytic enzymes doing different processes in the pools in the environment, then we might have evidence, stronger evidence, that one of these theories is correct. So when you look at, we're actually looking in this, and I'm sure NASA is looking hard to try to find, and we've sent probes to, right? Mercury, Venus, Mars, Pluto. Charon is a moon of Pluto. We've sent probes to moons of Jupiter. We're looking for these prebiotic conditions to try to find either microorganisms or find the precursors to microorganisms. If we do, then it supports, that's evidence supporting this explanation, this theory. So there's kind of 3 ideas as far as how life started on the planet, 3 main ideas. First, and this was the one I was taught when I was your age, is that, there was this primordial soup, and there was ultraviolet light from the sun, and some lightning from storms, and volcanoes provided all kinds of gases and elements from within the earth, things like, sulfur and necessary for proteins, etc. We're all released into the environment. We're all ready to go, and through various catalytic events, through various chemical events, you start to get all the 5 steps that we just discussed. Another concept is that maybe a comet or an asteroid just brought life to Earth. Maybe the life actually started on some other planet, some bacteria then, or some kind of microorganism was brought to Earth by some comet or meteor. The third concept is these volcanic vents deep in the ocean. There they have, they release carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide that then turns into sulfuric acid to some extent, nickel, iron, copper, sulfides, and other. They start to create those prebiotic molecules that then are recirculated and eventually form through those 5 steps initial life. Why the vents? Because today we know there's a whole ecosystem down there that's actually very different from the life that we see on the surface of the Earth. We know that in the crust of the Earth and there at the bottom of in the volcanic vents at the bottom of the ocean, we know that there are all these organisms that depend on chemical energy. They don't depend on sunlight. They don't do like the cyanobacteria did and use sunlight, use UV light as their source of energy. They actually use the vents themselves, those volcanic vents, as their source of energy. So these organisms use the heavy metals and the sulfur and the heat from the vents themselves to catalyze the various chemical reactions that run this ecosystem down at the bottom of the ocean. So it's very interesting that this we know exists. We actually observed it. We've recorded it. You can actually go on YouTube and see videos of it. Just search hydrothermic vents, bottom of ocean, and you'll see all kinds of weird life that lives down there. And, that's very different from that's up here on Earth. Up here on Earth, we depend on the sun, so all the plants are green, and they do photosynthesis, they produce our nutrients, etc. So if we look at these, we can see that this is a geological column representing geologic time, 4.6 billion, 4 billion, 3 billion, 2 billion, 1 billion, and then this is today. So the fossil history of all large eukaryotic organisms started up here. So if this is the the entire existence of the planet, all large eukaryotic life, that's not even just saying humans, right? Large eukaryotic life started here this late in the time period. Look how much time then humans have been on the earth, much, much smaller, probably close to the line itself. So we're here on our existence, our history is here. So this whole time of the earth has been around, has really been building up to this crescendo of multicellular life that started about 0.55 billion years ago. But when we look at the steps, those 5 steps we just talked about, step 1, where the earth was seeded with those prebiotic molecules, would be volatile organic molecules, are here all the way at the beginning of the earth's history. Then step 2 would be somewhere around here. Here's where you see those cyanobacteria colonies, the oldest form of life, 3.5 billion years ago. It's pretty early in the history of the earth that life started. This is where we first found life. I'm pretty sure that there was life before that developed into photosynthetic life, but that's another story. There's a lot of arguments and discussions, as you can imagine. The evidence for this it's somewhat convincing. However, there's all kinds of interpretation of such evidence and arguments back and forth. But one thing's for sure: cyanobacteria probably existed this long ago. That fossil evidence is pretty convincing that it existed. The arguments are really about how long ago. Was it earlier than 3.5? Was it late? Was it earlier? Was it later? So those are kind of where to draw this line is the argument. The idea that cyanobacteria is the oldest one we found. Clear communities of microorganisms. I think that's pretty clear that about somewhere around 3.5 billion years ago. So eukaryotic cells probably started a little, about a billion years later, right? Close to a billion years later, 2.7 billion years ago. So then when we look at where complex fossils of multicellular creatures are found, that's 0.55 billion years ago. Now, when they say complex multicellular organisms, they're not talking about elephants or horses or whales. They're talking about things that like conch shells and mollusks and things like that where you can find decent evidence of, but they're really, you would consider them simple organisms, but they're complex in that they're multicellular, they work together, they have different tissues, etc. All right, summarize the most accepted scientific models in origin of life. You should be able to summarize those from the previous page. How did the discovery of ribozymes assist in creating a plausible model for prebiotic origin of life? Remember, ribozymes are RNA molecules that act as enzymes, right? Like ribosomes, right? The precursors of ribosomes. Why is that then? Why is that allowing us to come up with this idea that there were these prebiotic molecules that then over time got more and more complicated, layered, started working with each other, and through natural selection became the prominent form of doing business on the planet? So when you're answering that, think about that. How old are the oldest fossils of microscopic life known to be? You can look at this chart. I actually just told you, but you can look at this chart and figure it out. Remember, probiont, right? And prebiotic means before. Precursors mean before life, so don't get that confused. How old are the earliest fossils of microscopic life known to be? I'll let you figure that out, again, based on this chart here. Name the planet or a planet or moon that is pending target for the spacecraft missions. Again, previous page, go look at it. How might the discovery of life elsewhere in the solar system influence probable explanations of the origin of life? So if you find life on one of these other planets or one of these moons that have the conditions of one of these three, then how might that influence that explanation? Would that support it? Would that contradict it? All right. So I think that takes care of this section. I'll upload a video again soon. Remember, stay out of crowds, 6 feet between you and someone else. Time is scary, but if you take care of your business and keep your good hygiene, it shouldn't be too big a problem. All right, I'll see you in the next video.